everybody to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning into the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that's going to bring you back for more content. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back. And I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get to the main event, if you are on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. Also, if you're listening from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who want to donate to the podcast, you can do it in a number of ways. So for those that want to do a one-time donation, you're still getting a feel for what we do with this podcast. You could donate through Cash App using our handle, $IDTALK4ED, or Venmo with our handle @KwameSM, or using PayPal with our URL, paypal.me/KwameSM. And for those who want to get some exclusive perks and behind the scenes content about everything Identity Talk, become a patron today. Join the community, have lots of extra information that's not being shared to the public. So make sure you go to patreon.com to learn more about the work that we do through Identity Talk. And of course, to catch future and past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at IDTALK4EDucators.com. And for those that are looking for a new book to add to your library, my book, Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in the Culture Affirming Classroom, is coming out in about a month. To learn more about the book, you can go to learntorelearn.com, or you can go straight to Amazon to get your pre-ordered copy. And this is a book that is for any person. I don't care if you're an educator, a parent, a community organizer. If you're somebody that's all about centering the humanity of children, regardless of where they come from, regardless of how they enter different spaces, this is the book for you. So I encourage you to get your copy and also get a copy for your staff, your organization. It's a great read. And I'm not just saying it because I'm the author. I truly believe that this is a book that can transform practice, not just in public and parochial and independent schools, but also international schools. So make sure y'all get y'all copy. Thank you for the support. All right, people. So today's guest is somebody who I've been following for a minute. One thing about me is I always like to learn from afar from people who I feel are doing the work that I aspire to do, people who I respect in terms of their scholarship and just how they move. And this brother is somebody who has been doing the work. He's got the receipts. He's done it as an instructional coach. He's done it as a teacher. And now he's doing it as an assistant principal. Currently, he's based in Singapore, but he's had many stops along the way. I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to bring on Dr. Darnell Fine to the podcast to tell us about his story and what brought us together today. So let's get him on. Yes, sir.
Thank you for having me, Kwame.
Man, pleasure to have you on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I loved hearing about your book in the intro too. So I definitely want to get a copy of it. It looks inspiring.
Yes, appreciate it. Appreciate it. So I know for you, before you started your career abroad, you were born in the Twin Cities, eventually got down to the ATL. So I know that. Let's start over there. Just tell me about those early years and those transitions.
Oh, you did your research. Oh, not many people knew I was born in the Twin Cities. Yeah, like I think Minnesota is in the news right now.
Again,
Presidential election. And one of the stories I have about growing up in education actually relates to Tim Walz. So the first year I went to high school was Tim Walz' school that he was teaching at. And I remember my history class was taught by the person that was eventually his commissioner for education in the state of Minnesota. At the time, I just remember vividly in that high school being the only Black kid in that history class and wanting to learn about myself and what I was being taught about being Black in America wasn't necessarily reflective of the history that I wanted to explore. And I remember that afternoon, right before dismissal, having social studies class, and the teacher showing an episode of Roots, and us not talking about that scene where there that slave ship in the Middle Passage, and everyone looking at me, and me feeling like I have a deep connection to this history, but no space to really explore it outside of me being that token Black kid in the classroom. I remember not seeing myself in that curriculum. I remember when I finally did, it was a choice project where we were exploring whatever Supreme Court case we wanted to explore. And I remember selecting at the time Brown versus Board of Education. I still have a copy of this paper. Part of it's handwritten, the other part we had to type. And I remember going to type it at the local library and having to go through the snow in Mankato to get to the library during a blizzard, and spending a lot of nights and having a handful of nickels and dimes to pay for the printing of that paper. And I remember I experienced writing that particular paper, but I was the only one within that classroom who wrote about Brown versus Board of Education. And I was trying to learn about myself and some connection to who I was, being a Black student in this predominantly white institution in rural Minnesota. And I love how Tim Walz speaks so passionately about being a teacher at this school and how inspiring that was. But I remember not being inspired as a Black student within this school. And it wasn't until I moved from the Twin Cities to Atlanta, Georgia, and I walked into one teacher's classroom, Miss Aaliyah Aziz. And I looked at the board, and she had written on the board, Africa with a K. And right below that, it said, Miss Aziz be tripping. And when people tried to correct her English, she explained to us that we have many voices in many rooms. Wow. And in this particular room, she welcomed our Black English vernacular. And outside of this room and other spaces, she taught us what it means to speak standardized English, or as she said it, cash English when we needed to get a job. She had us looking at Grimm Brothers tales and fairy tales, and taking Cinderella and remixing that tale from the perspective of our Mexican students, our Black students in Atlanta, our South Asian students, and saying, what would happen if you rewrote this particular fairy tale in a context that was relevant to you and culturally affirming to you? And how might we relearn or unlearn, to reference your book, what these fairy tales mean to you? She had us not only exploring language or exploring fairy tales, but giving us books that she thought would be relevant to us. So I remember she gave me Shakespeare's The Tempest, and she said, read it. I read it. She said, how do you like it? I said, it was okay. She said, read it again from the lens of the indigenous perspectives. And Caliban represents the colonized people. And it was a different learning, relearning of what it meant to read Shakespeare. And I remember more than anything, her leading this oratorical contest and me writing this poem about freedom during Black History Month. And this poem that I was writing about freedom had me exploring what it meant to go through the Middle Passage, but to an audience that understood the conditions of what it meant to be Black in America, and not the only one in the classroom exploring. And I remember that next year, her leading the oratorical contest again, and the theme being the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And it wasn't just me that was exploring this Supreme Court case. It was the entire community throughout all identities of the diaspora, whether you were West Indian, whether you were West African, whether you were American from the West End of Atlanta, Georgia, commuting to go to this particular school, or whether you were from Decatur. We were all in it together, exploring what this Supreme Court case meant to us 50 years later. And it was beautiful. So I tell both of those stories, one in the Twin Cities in rural Minnesota, and my experience being in Atlanta, being a student and feeling affirmed in my culture and in my own skin, versus folks with very good, not necessarily being responsive to who I was as a student.
Wow. So what better place to move to than Atlanta? You're talking about the epicenter of Blackness, and you think about all the HBCUs, you think about the civil rights history that's there. Where else will you go to thrive in your Blackness? But I also want to talk about what you mentioned. So you talked about Miss Aziz and how she was really into the counter narratives, how she was getting you to look at these different stories, these different articles and publications from different perspectives that are invisible. So I'm wondering, as you're going through that learning process, are you now starting to make connections as far as thinking about a career path in education? Was that the moment that you said, man, I want to do what Miss Aziz is doing? Like, I want to be a teacher.
Yeah, definitely. I think Miss Aziz inspired me to be a teacher. I also think, as much as I tried to do other things in life, I was always drawn back to education. So, post secondary, being at university, I was exploring a lot at my university. I was trying to write poetry, I was writing plays, I was researching and publishing some of my papers on Langston Hughes with the University of Louisville. I was in Providence going to different protests. My own civil rights activism inspired by being from Atlanta. And I was also in the teacher ed program. I was secretly getting certified when I was supposed to be getting my PhD. And I wanted to be in that teacher ed program because I went back to Atlanta one summer to serve as the dean of students at an independent school in Atlanta, which was very different than the public school I went to. And we had these different students that were in this summer program called Breakthrough Atlanta. And I recognized what it meant for these particular students to have identities that were so at odds with the teachers who were working with them, and wanting to bridge the gap of students I really identified with and these teachers that or these university students that were exploring what it would be like to be a teacher from Duke University and from all of these different universities around the US, but seeing that disconnect and wanting to be the bridge between those particular teachers and our students, but also recognizing that I needed to be there in the classroom with these particular students. So I got certified when I was at Brown. And even though I did not have the best experience living in Atlanta, I loved my high school, but it was tough living in Atlanta. I ended up going back to Atlanta to teach for several years. And it felt like that was my calling. And that if I truly believe education was a practice of freedom, I needed to be a practitioner of education, showing what it meant to create lab sites of freedom or to create classrooms where students felt liberated. So yeah, Mrs. Z's inspired that in me, and I tried to do other things, and I ended up going back.
So I love that you're talking about this, because I'm thinking about when I was back in the classroom and I felt like there are people around me, as far as colleagues, who just didn't come with the same lens as I did. And you're pushing them to see things the way that you see them, but the disconnect remains. So you end up kind of being in this silo where, all right, I know this is what's going to work for my students. I've tried to bring other people along, but they just not with it. So I'm wondering, during your time in Atlanta, your first teaching job, did you have those moments where you're just like, man, this is so isolating. I need people to be with me, but they're not rocking with me the way I feel they should?
I would say yes and no.
Okay.
Because I absolutely loved my school in Atlanta. We were a community, and I might not agree with a lot of the politics, with a lot of the folks within that community, but we were engaging in very hard conversations and we had critical friendship. And I will forever love the diverse perspectives from my first school in Atlanta. When we were struggling and we needed a place to go, like, there were individuals within that community said, we might not agree politically on things, but you can use our house to live in and stay in until you get back on your feet. I might have disagreed with some of the teaching methodologies, but I would sit with the math, science, and technology teacher and say, help me understand where you're coming from so that you can push me, but I can also push you to think differently about your practice. So not just personally, but professionally, we operated as a community that looked out for each other. I didn't want the teacher across the hall to be out here raggedy, and I was going to hold them accountable. And my dean of students, Alcine Mumby, she would come into my classroom. She's the dean of students, but she was also my associate teacher. And she would say, Darnell, it's not working. You need to rearrange.
Wow. I didn't even know that. Shout out to Alcine Mumby. Street Data podcast, right?
Alcine was one of my inspirations too.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yeah. Alcine was, all right, Darnell, it's raggedy. You got to do something differently here. And she would push me. I had people within that community that looked out for me. and really pushed me and helped me see things differently. And I did the same for them.
Yeah, that's what's up. Always good to be in community with people, even if you don't agree. We're not always going to agree on everything, but as long as we have a common goal as far as how we're going to push our students and get them to be at their best, that's what's most important.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, what you're saying is pretty normal. But I know that at some point, and we're going to get to the international part, but I know before we got there, you move out of Atlanta, now you go to Brooklyn. You go from this community of a school in Atlanta, now you're in an independent school where maybe the socioeconomic situation is a little bit different. Maybe the curriculum's a little different. There's a shift that has to happen. So I want you to talk about that, and I have another question that kind of follows up with that. But yeah, talk to us about that move.
Yeah, my move to Brooklyn was a bigger culture shock for me
Yeah.
than any place I've ever moved to internationally. And part of it was moving from Atlanta to New York, which was its own thing. But the other part, I was moving from a public school system to an independent school where there wasn't much oversight over the curriculum. So I remember the curriculum that was handed to me my first day, and it was in a manila envelope. And I opened that and I showed my partner, Armanda, and I pulled out the book. It was a book that was published in the 1970s, talking
What?
about the Roman Empire. That thing was dusty, and it had attached to it with a paper clip 3 pieces of paper. That was the curriculum. And as over-resourced as this school was, and as under-resourced as my school in Atlanta was, my school in Atlanta was miles ahead of what we were doing here. In my school in Atlanta, we had 3 or 2 Acer computers we were passing around to a classroom of about 30 students. And that was the tool we were using to research, and it wasn't enough. So we would do community work and research. I would take my kids to the local library, or I would take them to the Civil Rights Museum down the street. And I would say, you're gathering your data here, and I need you to figure out how else you're going to gather your resource connection about the different concepts you were studying. So I remember Emory, he chose Martin Luther King's speech, the genocide in Rwanda, and Michael Jackson's They Don't Really Care About Us.
Wow.
And this was a student who was in learning support that they said wasn't reading very well. And the connections he made between those 3 things and then himself. And the question he ended was, why are we calling Rwanda the Switzerland of Africa when Rwanda should exist on its own terms? Just Atlanta should exist in its own terms outside of the other cities in the US. Just as Michael Jackson was doing something beautiful in his own right, does he need to be considered the king of pop, or just an artist that doesn't exist within any frameworks of your hierarchies? And it was absolutely beautiful seeing him come into his own. This student who said the school did not see him for who he was articulating double consciousness without ever having to read W.E.B. Du Bois, and also talking about those different connections. So I compare that to the curriculum in Brooklyn that was handed to me, where we said, hey, you're going to teach about the Roman Empire with this book from the 1970s. So yeah, we had more money, but we were lacking in creativity in a lot of ways. And it wasn't the students lacking in creativity. It was the adults entrenched in those traditions in that system.
Wow, wow, wow. But I think one thing I can say about being in an under-resourced school is that it forces you to tighten up on your instruction. You got to be a supplementer. You got to be a researcher. You got to look for the best practices and the resources that are going to help your kids, because that those new textbooks aren't coming, that the kids can't take those textbooks home. They got to rent them out. So that you have to create your own scope of sequence. You have to do your own pacing guide and do things that normally in a district you'll be provided. So yeah, I feel
this goes back to Emily Stiles' quote that half of the curriculum walks into the room when the students do.
Come on.
That had to be the case.
Yes.
Because we didn't have the resources when we are the people with the knowledge in the room. So we would hold panel discussions. Our 8th graders would come talk to our 6th graders. And I think this is very much grounded in the history of Black literary tradition, or just Black cultural tradition. Nikki Giovanni says style has profound meaning to Black Americans. If we can't drive, we will invent walks, and the world will envy the dexterity of our feet. If we can't have ham, we will boil chitterlings. If we are given rotten peaches, We will make cobbler. If given scraps, we will make quilts. Take away our drums. We will clap our hands. We will prove the human spirit will prevail. We will take what we have to make what we need. And that was very much what we did in the classroom. We need confidence in our knowledge of who we are, and we use that knowledge to shape the curriculum, to guide our instruction, to see the value of the different folks that are in the room. And we did it with style. Just like Nikki Giovanni said, we did it and it was absolutely beautiful. And we make do with what we don't have or what we do have.
Yeah, and all that's true. That there's something very natural and organic about the Black aesthetic that you just cannot explain sometimes. No matter how many times people ask you, well, like, how do you do it? It's in me.
Yeah.
I can't teach it to you. You just have to have it in you. You know what I mean? Like, you can't teach that.
And what I want to do is, because everybody want to be Black, but don't nobody want to be Black, but you want the aesthetics, and you will never be able to get that aesthetics. But what I want you to do is to see me as a model of tapping into myself as an educator and tapping into my students' funds of knowledge and what they're bringing to the table, and do that for you.
That's right.
Like, I want you to tap into and remember whatever passion that led you to be a teacher outside of the extrinsic motivators of a paycheck, and really look at your values and your principles and get creative in bringing who you are to the classroom and letting your kids know they can be their full selves with people who aren't like them, and embrace them and leverage the cultural assets that they are also bringing, whether they're Black or not. Who are they and who are you? And how might we leverage that in the classroom?
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. Hope to hear from you. And let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. Yeah, for sure. Now, going back to your independent school experience in Brooklyn, now we know with independent schools, typically you see a lot of privilege, a good amount of classism. You really start to see the disparities in terms of the socioeconomic statuses of students. I'm wondering if being exposed to that prepared you for what you would ultimately witness when you got to the international school ecosystem, because we see that international schools as well. So I don't know if this was a precursor or like that crystal ball that let you know, okay, watch out for these because you're going to come across this too when you go abroad.
Yeah. And I think it manifests itself in different ways.
Sure.
And even my public school, like system in different ways, it's built on exclusion. Any of those systems will find ways to try to justify its own innocence. So forgive me, I've loved every institution that I've been in, but you can also say that I've internalized the values of those institutions, and in some ways I'll try to justify the innocence. But I hear you wanting me to tap into more of the criticality of how privilege and classism manifested itself. I think in Atlanta, we had lots of diversity of folks coming from different walks of life because it was a public school. But I also recognize that once our school merged with the local elementary school, there were a lot of folks excluded that were zoned out because folks wanted to create their community school that were for their students. And it was time for me to go because I'm like, I don't like where this is going. And in Brooklyn, a lot of our students were there on scholarships, financial aid, and some of them were grandchildren with grandparents that paid for their schooling, and their parents were the artsy parents of Brooklyn that didn't have a whole lot of money, but some of them did. So I was in a very unique situation in Brooklyn where even though kids did have some class privilege, they were also coming from such unique and diverse backgrounds. And it was just different than a typical independent school. I would say it wasn't until I went to London where I was truly confronted with class disparities. Like folks like to say London's not a hardship post, so they're not paying you a whole lot to be an educator there. But there are a number of families there with an immense amount of privilege. And I remember one particular family, multi-billionaires. And I remember the assumptions that I was carrying about like these billionaire families. And I remember I was my first year teaching there. And I remember doing this advisory activity where I wanted the students to create collages of their identities. They left a mess, Kwame. I was just like, you know what? Whatever. I told them leave. 11 of them left.
Okay.
I turn around and I see one of the kids on his hands and knees. It's the billionaire kid whose families are billionaires, the kid who has bodyguards stationed outside of the school while he's attending there. On his hands and knees, picking up the different scraps of paper, saying, we shouldn't have left this a mess like this, Mr. Fine. This is not okay. And I remember working off of these different assumptions during parent-teacher conferences and sitting down with his mom and saying he's struggling with writing conventions. And she looked me in the eyes and she said, Mr. Fine, I don't give a shit about writing conventions. I want you to teach him how to think. And here I am working off of all of these different assumptions about this particular family. And they showed me that we value something different. And I ended up being really close with this family. They threw my going away party when I left London. They were consistently like supportive of the work that I do. When I went back to London to do the board training, she was right there talking about the impact of culturally responsive practices and helping her son see himself in the curriculum, even though they had all of this money. So yes, I was confronted with extreme amounts of privilege and classism, but I also want to recognize the intersections and the values that folks still bring with them that might not be seen. People weren't seeing her child either. He was an Indian kid that was still feeling excluded in so many different ways and not seen. And I said, hey, I still need this kid to see himself. I still need to build those connections. And yeah, like here I am, once again, justifying the innocence of the organizations that I've been a part of. But it really was beautiful. It really was. And I've seen kids who were on scholarship in London sitting across from kids who wanted for nothing in the world and were still in community with each other, engaging in conversations about race, about class, about a number of different critical topics. And I have stories for days about London.
I want to stay on that thread because you mentioned privilege. And I know when we're Black men in America, we see all the different ways we're dehumanized and marginalized and excluded and isolated. And we know what that looks like. We know what the racism looks like. I know in my case, I know what it feels like to experience colorism. I know what it's like to be separated from other groups and be an outcast. I know what that's like. But then when you go abroad, you recognize that people look at you differently in terms of class, status, even the privileges that you hold. And I think that's what opened my eyes when I got abroad. It's just how it's just different. So I'm wondering, when you got to London, how did those 3 Ps, we're talking privilege, positionality, power, how did that influence the work that you were doing at the school as a teacher at the time?
Yeah, I want to talk about that through a few different lenses. Because I remember in London, and then I can even say in Singapore, there are times in which I have to justify my existence within the space.
Okay.
I don't think there's been a school that I've been in where I wasn't met with extra scrutiny before I went through the doors or the gates by security guards.
All right.
And at every single school that I've taught in, whether it's the public schools in Atlanta or even my school in Singapore, where I've had to speak resume, so to speak, where I've had to name my qualifications whenever I get a job, whenever I step into a leadership role. So I recognize my positionality being a Black educator within these different spaces. And I think just inherently, educational spaces make me hyper aware of my Blackness, whether it's as a student or whether it's as an educator. And some of that's mediated when I get a degree and students call me Dr. Fine. That affords me more credibility and privilege. But the other thing that I want to do in regards to this question, Kwame, is to also recognize what you said at the beginning of being a Black man in these spaces. That affords me both privilege, but also positions me in a way where I am marginalized and minoritized. But as a Black man, both you and I can perpetuate misogynoir. Also recognizing that the Black women within our institutions have different experiences than either you or I would have in a school. And I'm thinking specifically about all of the Black women's experience in the different schools that I worked at. They experience a sort of double jeopardy. They experience intersecting oppressions that I will never be able to fully understand. And in a lot of ways, I've been complicit in because I am afforded certain privileges as a man due to patriarchy. And that's something that I think we have to grapple with in a lot of DEI spaces when we talk about injustice, especially if there are Black men in leadership. We have to turn and we have to look within ourselves and say, how are the Black women and women of color, but particularly Black women, treated in the different spaces that we are leading? And how is it part of our own moral liability? Also, the power that we are misusing and weaponizing in a lot of ways by creating exclusionary spaces for Black women. And that's something I've been grappling with quite a bit. Layla Saeed, I think her name is, or said, created this workbook called Me and White Supremacy. I was working on a workbook called Me and Misogynoir, and how different Black men in education need to do some of that work, as well as non-Black women, as well as other non-Black men need to engage in work around how we are perpetuating misogynoir.
Yeah, and that's so important. I think the more I delved into Dr. Crenshaw's work around intersectionality, the more I realized, wow, I do have all these privileges. I didn't realize the amount of sexism that was going on around me. I didn't realize how easy it is for me to navigate certain spaces compared to my wife, who's also in a leadership capacity at an NGO. And I'm seeing some of the dynamics that she experiences in that role. So just seeing that firsthand, like, I know it's difficult for our Black women when it comes to that. But you mentioned something about how, as a Black man, we have to sometimes credential ourselves. And that's not something that we always do. We always taught to be humble. And I feel like it's something that's more innate for white folks to do. They're quick to mention the accomplishments and the degrees and the years of experience and the places they've gone. And we're just like all about the grind. And I just had this conversation with somebody the other day about this. But here's the thing that kills me. You mentioned the fact that you had to do that for yourself, but I'm looking at a brother who's got a doctorate, graduated from an Ivy League school, has all this experience and wealth of knowledge, and yet you still had to go through it. I just want to make sure I frame it for those who are listening so they understand, even with all those accomplishments, you can still get that treatment.
All the time.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. But I do want to talk about DEI for a second. So we know what's happening stateside with Project 2025 and the anti-CRT legislation and all that's going on. But we also know that it's something that we're pushing to implement in our international schools. But I do believe that the way that it's done is different because the contexts are different in those settings. So for those who may not be familiar with what that's like in an international school setting, I'd love for you to share what you believe are some of the differences in terms of the approach you take with the DEIJ work in Atlanta versus what you would do in London or Singapore, just from your experience.
Yeah, and if we are to be culturally affirming and culturally responsive and culturally sustaining, we need to recognize that context shapes everything.
Yes.
In Atlanta, the struggles rooted in the history of segregation and the legacy of the civil rights movement. There, the work is deeply tied to confronting history head on. And in London or Singapore or other places, the conversation shifts. And the subtleties of racism and classism and other isms are sometimes denied or hidden under the guise of international mindedness. I don't work, so I pick and choose what schools and which organizations I work with now. But I've worked with over 80 different schools as well as every single regional educational organization like IRCOS, Tri-Association, CISA, et cetera. I see the minimization, the race evasion. Some people call it color blindness. I try not to use that term because it's ableist, where we operate from the standpoint of neutrality in assuming that there's a such thing as culturally neutral terrain, and we're all just a human. All lives matter. And it ignores the fact that racism, privilege still exists, and they may operate differently in different contexts, but we still have to unmask and dismantle it. Your host country might be predominantly Vietnamese, but when we look at the leadership within your school and in your organization, in your hiring, it looks the same all the way to 1954. And 1954 reflected something in the US when your school was modeled after a school in New England. And those legacies still persisted and still remain. So I think we do have to recognize that contextually things are different. But in a lot of ways, we don't just shed these systems when we fly from Massachusetts or Boston to Ho Chi Minh City. On the plane, it doesn't just wash off on us once we fly across the Atlantic or the Pacific. And those things still very much so exist within our schools and our organizations. I like to say that folks say DEI work is an American thing, but says the different international schools with American in its name or with an Americanized curriculum. And what's also funny is like this whole DEI conversation stateside, DEI work is considered to be anti-American. So folks just don't want DEIJ to exist anywhere. Personally, I don't even use the term DEIJ really. I use it as more of a symbol for folks to understand. But the practitioners and the scholar activists that I've read, from W.E.B. Du Bois in 1901, he didn't call this DEI work. He called it Pan-Africanism. And in 1933, Carter G. Woodson didn't call it DEI work. He called it the miseducation of the Negro and how we needed to educate ourselves more deeply. Gertrude Ayer, the first principal in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s, didn't call this DEIJ work. She called it education and us engaging in deep learning about our communities. So this work is simultaneously old, and this concept of DEI may be new semantics, but what we're talking about here is rehumanizing ourselves if we're perpetuating oppression, and also humanizing ourselves if for so long the curriculum and teaching has dehumanized us in the classroom.
Right. And all those scholars you mentioned, if you read their works, when you read them, you'll notice that they had the answers to the questions that we still have today in 2024. They had those answers a century ago. They knew they had the crystal ball. They told us exactly what was going to happen. There's a reason why schools don't want those books in their buildings, because they know that the answers are there.
Yeah, definitely. And this is why it's so important for people like you to keep writing these books and keep adding to the body of literature and keep adding to the libraries, keep telling those particular stories. And not all stories have to be written, but it's important for us to make space to hear those stories that fall outside of dominant narratives, to remind us that there are other perspectives and there are other ways of being that we need to hear and embrace.
So I want to switch gears and talk about invisible tax for a second. And this is something that's very common, particularly for Black educators. The idea that we come in and we're teetering the line between exhibiting passion, but also perpetuating saviorism. Because we feel like we got to do a lot more than what our job description states, because we just know like what the needs are for the community. At least we think we know. I think that's where the saviorism sometimes can creep in without us noticing. I'm wondering, being a Black educator in international schools, do you believe that invisible tax is something that manifests itself in the same way as it does stateside, just from your experience?
Yes, and not completely yes. There is an invisible tax that Black educators pay, and it is a tax of our emotional labor, of having to navigate spaces that are often not designed for us. And the tax exists whether in public schools in the US or international schools, where the expectation is that our presence represents a commitment to diversity, that tax that we're paying is us as the token.
Right.
When the environment doesn't truly value the token that is in the space. And I've worked to chisel away at the structures of every institution that I've worked at to move beyond kind of that tokenization. But it wasn't tax that I had to pay. Like when they said, hey, like in international school, golden handcuffs, the roads are paved with gold here. I didn't know that I was going to have to arrive there and be the one to pave the roads myself and make them golden for us, because I did not go to the international schools for the money. I went to have a different cultural experience to learn more about myself, as Nina Simone did when she went international, as James Baldwin did when he went international, as Richard Wright, as Paul Robeson, as the legacy of all of those, yes, exactly. The legacy of all of those different Black activists, thinkers, and artists. I wanted to feel what it was like beyond American shores, where my mobility for my ancestors was restricted. So that's why I went, with the expectation that these schools that are internationally minded would embrace these different divergent perspectives. And what I found was there was a lot of work that needed to be done. And I was the person that needed to do it in a lot of cases, or at least in every school that I've taught in. And I love the work. I absolutely love the work. I'm at times exhausted by that taxation, and I have to be careful of my own John Henryism of myself alongside the machine, and working myself until I'm burned out or worse, or seeing it as a labor of love. Like when I'm paving those roads or making those paths, I'm doing it with the expectation that I'm doing it for those who will come after me.
That's right.
That I am in a school right now where there were only 3 or 4 Black educators there when I was hired. And now there are over 24 Black educators at all positions of the school. And I absolutely love the work. It was a labor of love. And I was able to build community for myself and for others, and hopefully for them. And I know it's hard, and I know it's difficult, even if there's more of us. But I did that for myself as well as the community. And I'm also doing that for all minoritized groups. I'm going to fight for our neurodivergent kids. That's because right. I want them to be able to see themselves. I'm going to fight for our multilingual kids because I want them to see themselves. I'm going to fight for our trans and non-binary kids because I want them to see themselves. So it's not just about me and my identity and that taxation. It's about creating a space for everyone to be their full selves with people who aren't like them. And that's a tax I'm willing to pay, regardless of the organization that I'm a part of. And I'm okay with that. That's human work. That's life work. That's liberation work that I'm willing to do for every member of our community that doesn't feel a sense of belonging and feels like they aren't seeing themselves, not just in the curriculum, but also in the workplace. So that's my life work. And I find joy in it, even though it's hard.
So I want to make sure we wrap up the conversation. Man, I could talk to you all day, brother. I really can't. I want to ask you this question, and it's one that I ask everybody. How do you, Dr. Darnell Fine, stay true to the teacher in you?
I stay true by remembering that teaching is not just about instruction, it's about liberation. I remind myself every day that my role is not to tell people what to think, but to help them understand the power and beauty of their own minds and who they are. I stay true by allowing myself to not become complacent, to keep questioning, to always center the truth. I stay true to the teacher in me by creating spaces where every student and every educator can see themselves fully. I stay true by ensuring that the stories I tell and the lessons I learn from every member of our community affirm their humanity and the richness of our community. I stay true by centering love, understanding the power of imagination. I stay true to the teacher in me by practicing what I preach. It's living by my principles and ensuring that my professional learning spaces in my classrooms are spaces of liberation. And I'm constantly questioning not just others, but myself, and remaining open to growth in a learning organization. I can always learn. And I stay committed to the idea that education should be a practice of freedom for all people to have agency and to be able to shape the future as they see fit, in teaching to transgress. That is the book that got me into education. So when you talk about what inspired me, that book right there, and there's a chapter in there where she quotes the poet Adrienne Rich. And this is the professor's language, yet I need to talk to you. And our schools are often sites of oppression and restriction, yet they can also be spaces where we can get free, even if it's in our imagination, but also in real tangible ways. My great grandmother could not read, and she was a sharecropper in Arkansas. And I know part of her circumstance was dictated by her not having the education that she needed. So I saw my granny, who had a thirst for learning, and said, I'm going to treat education as a practice of freedom, and I'm going to get what was stolen from her all of those years back. Your experience might not be my experience and my history, and I am talking as a Black man in education. But I want everyone to figure out how they can see themselves, but not just figure it out alone, but figure it out in community with the educators, students, parents, and all of the community members. The leaders should be doing that alongside them so that they can be their full selves and outside of school.
Whew, man, that was a word. Man, it's probably the best stay true to teaching you message I've gotten so far, man. Oh, you came with it. Yes, man. But Darnell, thank you so much. Thank you for the time. I think the listeners and the viewers got to learn a lot about you, but also took away some things that should help them with their practice moving forward. But before I let you go, just let people know how they can connect with you on social media, and also feel free to plug in any services you provide to different schools across the globe.
So yeah, I have deactivated my account on the platform formerly known as Twitter. You might be able to find me once every 3 weeks on LinkedIn. You can find me in community in person. Definitely, we can be in community and spaces together, facilitating different workshops at different conferences. And some of the Facebook boards I might be on, I don't know how to tell people how they can access me because I am incredibly introverted. But if we do cross paths in an authentic way, I am here to have this conversation with you. So thank you, Kwame, for finding my email and reaching out so that we can connect, because it's been beautiful sharing this space with you. And if there are other folks that by happenstance or strategically find me to connect, I would love to have similar conversations with you about how we can support each other and learn from each other. So thank you.
I appreciate you, brother. And I appreciate the fact that you're protecting your space. You're protecting your peace. Sometimes we can be overly saturated with this social media world. So I get it. You want to monitor your usage. I get you there. But listen, people, it's a wrap. On behalf of Darnell, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.
See y'all later.